Welcome back for Chapter 5, Part 5, whatever you want to call it, of Inside the Empire. That's what we're calling this chapter: Authentication, Authorization, and Access Controls. And of course, there's a lot of material here that you are going to potentially see and be tested on as part of your ISC2 Certified in Cybersecurity certification. So make sure as you go through this that you take notes. Keep focus for those bold gray terms followed by the orange definition, as those become really key. Now, as you can imagine, we've talked previously about end users, about them creating good passwords, being aware of cybersecurity risks that come at them. And here, we called that the first line of human defense, right? This is the first line of logical defense, starting with authentication, making sure that the only people that gain access to our data are those authorized personnel, the people who are officially allowed to enter a specific area when we talked physical security, access systems and data, and perform certain tasks. So we don't want everybody to be able to delete files from our network. Would you agree? And of course, unauthorized personnel are simply people who are not allowed to do those things. We want to keep those people out, and it starts with good authentication. So, these three concepts, the triple A's, as I like to call them, is paramount to protecting any organization's digital empire for sure. So, just as you know, I like to give you a brief history. So, 1960s, right? Growing use of computers, critical applications led to initial development of access controls, and we talked about that initial digital password in the last chapter, right? So that gets extended further so that individual users are given their own unique password. They're not sharing passwords. Security logs start to get developed, especially, as we'll see in just a minute, well, right now in the 1970s, with the advancement of the Multics operating system. So this introduced protection rings, okay? And what are protection rings? Well, they're essentially like access controls. So different privilege levels, administrator, end user, who can read files, who can read and write files, who can read, write, and delete files, right? So this really influenced the modern security models that we see today within, say, Linux or Microsoft's Active Directory. In 80s and 90s, of course, right, the risks start coming about, all these threats start coming across, and we see growth of the internal threat, right? That end user, that person that gets mad at the company, steals data before they leave to go to a competitor. So, in the 80s and 90s, we introduced network operating systems, the internet. There was more data to protect. There was more access that needed protection. And one of those was called role-based access control, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. When you implement Active Directory, this is a great way to do it, that you don't implement it based on the user and the user's permissions, but you implement it based on the role. That way, if, say, a manager leaves and someone else, another person steps into that role, if you've done role-based authentication correctly, role-based access control, you simply assign those permissions for manager to the new user, and off you go. We'll talk more about that in detail. So in 2000s, biometric authentication, fingerprint, facial recognition introduced. Again, an additional level of unique security. So this was no longer a password that could be hacked through phishing, etc. So 5.2, security controls. Now in this section, I'm going to briefly bring back physical controls so that we have the opportunity to look at all three types of controls, that being physical, administrative controls, and technical controls, just so we can do a compare and contrast and really understand the technical controls that we're going to talk about and how they may be implemented in physical as well as administrative controls. So physical controls involve the implementation of tangible measures to protect physical assets of an organization, including its infrastructure, its hardware, its facilities. So not just facilities, right? We may have doors that are secured through biometrics so that only, again, authorized personnel can enter where those servers are stored, right? Because physical access can be a huge risk when we talk about, networks, okay? So purpose, prevent unauthorized physical access, of course, like we talked about. Protection from theft and attack, vandalism, okay? Natural disasters, security guards, surveillance cameras, locked doors, and then, as I said, biometrics. And so these safeguard the physical components of an organization, not just the building, not just perhaps personnel, but also the assets, the hardware assets, the software assets stored within the building, right? So that's the first one to compare. And then we'll move on to administrative controls, which we will talk in depth about when we hit Chapter 9, Managing the Maze, Compliance, Risk Management, and Governance. So we're going to talk about administrative controls, as it says, are policies, procedures, and guidelines designed to manage an organization's overall organization and security posture. I really should improve that a bit. But, its purpose basically is to manage and influence people through policies and procedures. Make sure that they know what they can do, what they can't do, etc. within an organization, right? So any organization you go to that might have internet access, that has computing assets, probably has an acceptable use policy stating what you can and cannot do on their computers. What websites you can access, which websites you can't, that kind of stuff, right? So again, we'll talk about this in detail in Chapter 9. The importance becomes, ensuring compliance with local, state, and federal requirements, right? And lay out an organization's mission and values. So these policies and procedures are going to play right along with those mission and values, all of which combined ensures quality and effective governance and good culture, okay? So examples are training programs, password management, impact on culture, as I said. Importance is it ensures quality and effective governance. So technical controls is really where we're going to spend the rest of this series, because these technical controls are how we ensure the quality of the CIA triad within our organization. And you might remember the CIA triad as confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So technical controls, also known as logical controls, if you think about it, logical software, right? Logical data, are the security controls, safeguards, and countermeasures for an information system that are primarily implemented and executed by the information system through mechanisms contained in the hardware, software, firmware, etc. So as I talked about, one great example of this is Microsoft's Active Directory, okay, in which we can really get granular on how a user is authenticated. Is there multi-factor authentication? What does it mean to be authorized into the system? And then finally, what can an end user or a role access? What can they do with that access, right? So examples, encryption and firewalls, intrusion detection. So IDS, antivirus, access control lists, and again, Microsoft Active Directory. So as we talk about this, keep in mind that this principle of technical controls is going to play out in future chapters when we talk about network and network security and client end user devices, securing those, etc. So the importance here is it provides a robust security infrastructure and is essential for protecting information systems against threats. Folks, if people can't get in, they can't threaten our data. All right, so that's it for part 1. In part 2, we are going to dive into authentication. I'll see you there.